Get it loaded.
She
We
was
have
just
incoming.
loading
Let's go.
Apache
Move.
ammo until the pilot spotted the forbidden tattoo and went pale. The desert
Sure.
morning had a way of testing people,
Incoming
heat
energy
rising off the
surge.
tarmac,
Brace for
wind
impact.
sharp enough to carry
Defense
sand
systems
like
failing.
needles,
We've
and the
lost
long
port
stretch of
shields.
runway shimmering under a white Sunday.
Hang
Yet the
on.
woman
Hold on,
standing
hang
beside
on.
the AH-64 Apache didn't seem bothered by any of it. She worked in silence, feeding the heavy 30mm rounds into the M230 chain gun's ammo belt with a precision that felt almost ritualistic. Slow.
You think you can stonewall
Steady.
us? Give
Exact.
me the coordinates now.
Nothing wasted. The brass glinted along
Don't
the curve
scare
of the
me.
belt, light catching on her flight suit olive, worn and torn slightly along her right side. The desert wind slipped through that small tear and revealed something beneath. Just a flicker, a shard of ink, but enough. A geometric tattoo, sharp lines, interlocking shapes, too deliberate to be decorative. Something that looked tactical, classified. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did, and simply didn't care. A few pilots nearby saw her and snickered, the kind of laughter born from people who assume the world bends around their rank. Look at Ammo Girl getting an early start. Careful, don't scratch our bird. Nothing in her expression changed. She slid another link of the belt into place, fingers moving with a competence that made their jokes feel childish. The calmer she stayed, the more annoyed they became. Her silence was a mirror, one they didn't enjoy looking into. Then came the rhythmic strike of boots against concrete. A pilot approached with clipboard in hand, sunglasses reflecting the Apache's dark panels. He was a captain, young, sharp, and absolutely confident he outranked whoever she was. "Hey, Thorne, let me double-check that." The sentence died. His hand froze mid-air. The clipboard tilted in his grip. His mouth opened, but sound refused to come out. He wasn't looking at her face. He was staring at the triangular tear in her flight suit and the impossible ink beneath it. Not a pretty tattoo. Not something someone gets on a whim. But the mark of a unit the military had sworn never existed. A unit whispered about in sealed rooms. A unit whose files were more blacked out than readable. A unit only mentioned by people with clearance, several levels above his own. He swallowed hard, voice cracking when he finally managed to speak. That can't be real. Still, she didn't look at him. She kept loading ammo with movements too fast, too precise, checking the feed tray, adjusting the belt, verifying angles techniques he had only seen from operators who'd done this under fire, in the dark, with everything on the line. Behind him, another soldier slowed his walk, eyes narrowing as he caught sight of the ink. Then another, and another. Ripples. Shock, spreading like heat waves along the airfield. No way. That symbol, I thought that program was shut down. No one dared step closer. No one dared break the quiet that was suddenly heavier than the desert heat. Finally, the woman turned just enough for her eyes to meet the captain's. They were steady, cold but not hostile. The eyes of someone who had seen things, done things, survived things. If you recognize it, her voice was low, controlled. Then you know exactly what you're looking at. Every laugh died. Every whisper stopped. Because with a single exposed mark accidentally revealed by a desert breeze, the entire hierarchy on that runway inverted. A sudden chirp cracked through the silence. The radio clip to her hip blinked red, signaling an encrypted channel. Unit 7, respond immediately. She straightened, closed her torn flight suit with a calm pull of the zipper, locked the ammo belt into the gun's receiver, stood tall in the wind. I was never here just to load ammo. And in that moment, the airfield felt like it shifted, tilting around the one person everyone had underestimated. The airfield settled into an uneasy quiet as she stepped away from the Apache, moving with the controlled confidence of someone accustomed to pressure far greater than a captain's stare. And although the morning sun never relented, the tension radiating from the watching pilots somehow felt heavier than the desert heat itself. She headed toward the maintenance bench to collect a diagnostic module, her footsteps measured and unhurried, leaving behind a handful of men who could not decide whether to speak, retreat, or pretend they had not just witnessed something they should never have seen. The captain tried to regain his composure, straightening his shoulders and clearing his throat, yet the slight tremor in his hand betrayed that whatever he'd recognized on her skin had shaken him harder than he dared admit. As she connected the diagnostic unit to the weapons interface, a pair of younger mechanics approached with the careless bravado of men who had not noticed the shift in atmosphere, one nudging the other while smirking as if a private joke had just taken shape in his mind. He tilted his chin and drawled that she should leave the fancy calibrations to real pilots, unaware that 3 officers behind him had gone pale at the notion of any interaction with her. She didn't turn, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge the provocation. Her fingers continued to move with a meticulous grace that made even the machine seem calmer in her presence, as though the Apache itself recognized the familiarity of her touch. The mechanics exchanged glances, expecting a reaction that never came, and the absence of conflict seemed to frustrate them more than any sharp retort could have, because her silence suggested not weakness, but a depth they could not measure. One of them tried again, his voice louder and laced with irritation, claiming she was just a loader with delusions of expertise. But the desert wind washed his words into nothing as she reran a diagnostic sequence with a speed that made the captain step closer, his curiosity wrestling with a cautious respect he had not shown moments earlier. She removed a panel beneath the cannon assembly, revealing a misaligned feed guide that could have caused a catastrophic jam during flight. And the way she corrected it, 3 adjustments, 2 checks, 1 final lock left. No doubt, she had done this under circumstances far more dangerous than a calm morning at an airbase. The captain opened his mouth to ask how she noticed it so quickly, but the look she gave him, steady, unreadable, almost surgical, reminded him of the tattoo and the shadow of a unit whose name was spoken only behind closed doors. Far across the tarmac, a lieutenant from the operations division approached with hurried steps, scanning the runway as though searching for someone specific, and when his gaze landed on her, the rigid line of his jaw tightened in a mixture of recognition and apprehension. He slowed drastically, as if entering a perimeter he wasn't authorized to cross, and his eyes darted from her to the captain and back again, clearly debating whether to interrupt whatever was unfolding. She finished the recalibration, reattached the panel, and stood from her crouched position with the composed steadiness of someone who had been trained to treat every movement as part of a broader mission. The lieutenant cleared his throat, hesitating before addressing her with a stiff formality that immediately silenced the remaining chatter on the airfield, and even the pilots who had mocked her earlier turned their heads, suddenly aware of the subtle but undeniable shift in chain of command. He informed the captain that higher command would be conducting an unplanned readiness drill, though his tone made it clear the drill was merely a cover for something else, something sensitive enough that he struggled to maintain eye contact with her. She simply nodded, her expression revealing nothing, and walked toward a secondary equipment rack to prepare the final loadout procedures, each step deliberate, each movement echoing an unspoken warning that no one dared confront. As she worked, the captain approached again, his voice lower and more cautious than before, asking whether she had served in the weapons evaluation program, a harmless question on the surface, but one that implied he was trying to rationalize the impossible mark he had glimpsed. She didn't answer immediately, choosing instead to secure a belt of rounds into its transport housing, before giving him a look that felt less like defiance and more like a reminder that some questions were not his to ask. He stepped back, swallowing hard, and the suspicion taking shape in his mind only deepened as she powered down the diagnostic module with the decisive movements of someone who had spent years doing work no one was supposed to remember. Across the field, whispers spread among the ground crew as they watched her with a mixture of awe and nervous curiosity, and although none of them approached, their glances spoke of rumors resurfacing stories about operatives who vanished from official rosters, about experimental units that were dissolved on paper but continued to function through untraceable channels. She completed the loadout, sealed the munitions access panel, and brushed the last trace of grit from her gloves with a controlled exhale, as though settling her mind for something far larger than the morning duties of an ammo tech. The lieutenant received a radio call, listened for several seconds, and then looked at her with a level of caution that bordered on fear, because whatever message he received clearly referenced her directly. He announced that command required all flight crews to stand by for immediate briefing, and though the order did not concern her position on paper, Several officers instinctively stepped aside as she walked past, creating a silence that followed her like a shadow stretching across the tarmac. She moved with the calm certainty of someone who had long ago stopped seeking permission to exist in spaces that others believed were above her pay grade. The captain watched her go, unable to shake the realization that he had just witnessed a fragment of a truth buried deeper than his clearance allowed, and the uneasy knot forming in his chest told him that whatever she was, whoever she had been, would soon matter far more than anyone on the airfield wanted to admit. The tattoo beneath her torn flight suit, the unspoken command in her movements, and the encrypted call she received all pointed toward a reality in which she was not simply part of their base, but part of something operating far above it. And as the wind swept across the runway, carrying the distant hum of rotors preparing for flight, every man on that field sensed a change gathering at the horizon, a change tied directly to the quiet woman they had failed to see until it was too late. The briefing call echoed across the airfield with an urgency that prickled beneath the surface of every conversation, and although the announcement was formally directed at the pilots, the quiet woman moved with a deliberate calm toward the auxiliary staging area, as if she already knew she would soon be needed somewhere beyond the boundaries of her official assignment. Her presence disrupted the casual rhythms of the base in small but telling ways, because every time she passed a group of personnel, their voices thinned and their movements stiffened, as though the environment itself had become aware of a classified truth sitting in plain sight. A pair of senior crew chiefs exchanged tense glances while reviewing the maintenance logs, whispering that her diagnostics had completed in half the usual time, and although they tried to rationalize the data as a glitch, both men found themselves silently watching her with an unease they did not dare put into words. She continued toward a storage kiosk to retrieve a secondary arming tool, and the simple act of entering the shaded alcove caused two junior crewmen to step aside so abruptly that a metal crate nearly slipped from one of their hands. Yet she simply nodded once, neither reassuring them nor inviting questions, and resumed her work with that same measured precision. When she returned to the Apache, the pilot who had mocked her earlier attempted to reclaim his confidence, approaching with a forced swagger that didn't quite mask the stiffness in his shoulders, and he tried to tease her about overstepping the job description, as if humor might erase the fear gnawing at the edges of his courage. She didn't respond. Instead, she began performing a torque check on the weapon mount with movements so exact that even the captain found himself pausing nearby, uncertain whether he should interrupt a task. She clearly understood better than he did. The pilot scoffed loudly, insisting she step away so he could inspect the adjustments himself, but the captain's sharp glance silenced him before she ever needed to acknowledge the comment. She tightened the final bolt, stepped back from the weapon housing, and murmured a single technical observation that made the captain's expression shift from skepticism to reluctant admiration, because the correction she identified was something normally flagged only by advanced-level weapons officers trained for complex combat readiness procedures. The young pilot stared at her as though she'd just spoken a language he wasn't supposed to understand, and the sudden weight of embarrassment hung over him like a shadow he could not escape. Across the runway, the operations lieutenant returned, clearly more agitated than before, carrying a small encrypted tablet that he clutched against his chest as if it contained information too volatile for open air. He scanned the area until his eyes locked on her, and despite the sunlight glaring off the tarmac, his steps faltered with the uncertain rhythm of someone approaching a threshold he wasn't sure he had permission to cross. She turned slightly, acknowledging him without shifting her posture, and he paused several paces away, lowering his voice as he informed her that the readiness drill had been modified into a rapid response assessment driven by unusual external intelligence indicators. The lieutenant's phrasing was deliberately vague, but she caught the tremor hidden beneath his measured tone, and the faint tightening around her eyes was the only sign that the message aligned with something she already suspected. He hesitated further, suggesting that if she happened to be available, Command might request additional support, though he quickly added that he wasn't authorized to formally issue such a request. She simply answered with a quiet, "Understood," and the lieutenant retreated uneasily, as if afraid he'd already said too much. Behind her, murmurs began circulating among the ground crew, moving like ripples across a pool as speculation bled into dread, and although no one dared speak directly to her, the shape of their reactions revealed more than words could. They had seen her precision, her discipline, and the strange tattoo that none of them could forget, and together those fragments formed a picture of someone who did not belong in the background roles they had assumed she did. The airfield seemed to contract around that realization, folding the ordinary rhythms of maintenance and preparation into a tension that thickened with each passing minute. She returned to the Apache to complete a final systems check, leaning into the cockpit to adjust the navigation feed with the calm assurance of someone intimately familiar with the aircraft's quirks. And although she made no effort to draw attention, the simple certainty in her movements caught the captain's eye again. He watched her silently, reading the ease with which she navigated controls that most technicians rarely touched, and the suspicion that had been festering in his mind hardened into something like recognition. Though he still could not reconcile how someone with her apparent expertise could possibly be assigned to a routine ammunition detail. She stepped down from the cockpit and closed the access hatch with a firm click that resonated faintly across the tarmac, and in that moment the sound seemed to punctuate the rising unease shared by everyone who had witnessed her throughout the morning. The young pilot from earlier lingered nearby, visibly wrestling with the urge to confront her again, but the memory of the captain's earlier warning glance, combined with the unsettling whisper of rumors, kept him rooted in place. She walked past him without a word, and the subtle way he shifted his stance to give her room revealed more fear than bravado. The lieutenant, still clutching his encrypted tablet, appeared once more at the edge of the group, this time looking directly at the captain before glancing uneasily toward her, and his posture conveyed a silent plea for discretion. She paused, reading the unspoken tension between officers who had not been trained to handle shadows, and the air seemed to still around her as the lieutenant mustered the courage to deliver a final message. He explained, haltingly, that command had flagged an irregular long-range signal 1 associated with a threat profile classified far beyond the clearance level of most personnel on the base. And though he didn't say her name, the implication that she was somehow connected to the response protocol hung in the air, like an unspoken order. She nodded once and turned away, her expression unreadable, her movements measured, and each step carrying the weight of a past no one else could see. The captain watched her walk toward the perimeter of the staging area, feeling the first stirrings of a realization he could neither confirm nor deny. The woman they had dismissed, questioned, and underestimated was not merely here by accident or assignment, but as part of something far larger, older, and more dangerous than the base was prepared to confront. And as the afternoon light intensified, narrowing shadows along the runway and casting harsh lines across the tarmac, every person who had crossed her path sensed they were living in the quiet moment before a storm, one that revolved around someone they should never have tried to belittle. The late afternoon heat pressed against the tarmac with a weight that seemed almost conscious, stirring a kind of anticipatory stillness as she moved toward the auxiliary hangar, and although her pace remained unhurried, every step she took felt charged with an invisible momentum that the surrounding personnel could sense but not fully understand. The captain followed several paces behind, compelled by a mixture of fear and curiosity, yet uncertain whether he should speak to her, because each time he gathered the courage to address the questions clawing through his mind, the memory of her tattoo returned with a clarity that stripped the words from his tongue. Inside the hangar, the atmosphere grew heavier as she retrieved a reinforced equipment case from the supply rack, her fingers tracing the coded latch with the familiarity of someone who had opened it countless times under circumstances far more dangerous than a readiness drill. And although the case bore a standard military serial, the faint shade of its finish hinted at a classification not meant for regular eyes. She knelt to inspect its contents, checking each tool with a meticulous calm that only deepened the captain's suspicion that she was preparing for something far beyond routine maintenance. And despite his attempts to rationalize her actions, he could not ignore the sense that her presence had become entangled with whatever intelligence anomaly command was scrambling to contain. Outside, the wind picked up sharply, carrying with it a low mechanical hum that at first resembled distant rotor noise, yet held a strange irregularity that made several technicians pause and exchange uneasy glances, as though the desert itself were issuing a warning none of them had the vocabulary to articulate. The lieutenant reappeared at the hangar entrance, visibly shaken and gripping his encrypted tablet tightly, while his eyes scanned the sky with the apprehension of someone who had just received information more frightening than he dared announce in public. When he approached her, he hesitated before speaking, choosing his words with painful precision as he explained that an unscheduled long-range sensor ping had detected a vectoring pattern matching profiles used only by hostile reconnaissance platforms designed to evade early detection. She absorbed the lieutenant's explanation with impassive calm, the faint tightening of her jaw offering the only outward acknowledgement that the threat was neither routine nor unexpected, and although she said nothing, the captain sensed she was already piecing together a chain of implications beyond anything he could logically contain. The lieutenant lowered his voice even further, admitting that the sensor signature carried an encrypted identifier that should have been impossible to encounter, because according to every declassified record, the opposing unit associated with that mark had been dismantled over a decade ago, following an operation so deeply buried that most of the surviving officers refused to speak of it even in private. The captain felt the air thicken as he listened, the weight of the lieutenant's words settling into his chest like a stone, and before he could ask how such a threat could possibly relate to their base, he noticed her steady gaze shift toward the runway, where the dying light of the sun cast long shadows that cut across the concrete like dividing lines between past and present. She closed the equipment case with a decisive motion, lifting it with a strength that contradicted her understated appearance, and walked past both men toward the hangar threshold with a soft but unmistakable resolve that suggested she had already accepted the path ahead. Several pilots, milling near the flight briefing room, sensed her approach and stiffened instinctively, aware that the uncertainty surrounding her had escalated into something far more immediate, and although they attempted to mask their nervous glances behind routine chatter, the tension radiating from their posture betrayed their fear that the quiet anomaly among them was about to become the center of a conflict none of them were prepared to face. She passed through their midst without acknowledging their stares, her focus fixed on the open expanse of the runway, where the hum from the horizon seemed to grow sharper, as if announcing the arrival of something drawn toward her presence like gravity. The captain finally forced himself to speak, jogging a few steps to catch up and asking in a strained, nearly trembling voice whether she had any knowledge of the incoming threat, but she stopped just long enough to meet his gaze with a calmness that silenced him more effectively than any reprimand his commanders had ever delivered. She told him, in a tone almost too quiet for the wind to carry, that certain forces never truly dissolve, even when the world believes they have vanished, and that sometimes the ghosts buried in sealed files eventually return to finish what history refused to acknowledge. The cryptic weight of her words sent a chill through him despite the oppressive heat, and for a moment he stood motionless, realizing that whatever truth she carried was bound so deeply to classified history that even asking further might constitute a breach of protocol he would never recover from. She continued toward the runway, the lieutenant trailing behind with visible apprehension, and as she neared the Apache, the low hum from the desert intensified into a rhythmic pulse that reverberated across the airfield in a way that made several ground crew instinctively take cover behind equipment crates. She placed the equipment case beside the aircraft, scanning the horizon with an expression that blended recognition and resignation, as though she had been expecting this confrontation for far longer than anyone around her could imagine. And when the first faint glimmer of movement appeared in the distant sky, the atmosphere across the base shifted into a brittle tension that bordered on dread. The captain reached her side again, unable to stop himself from asking whether the threat was connected to her former unit, and although she did not answer aloud, the flicker in her eyes confirmed more than any explanation could. As the unidentified shape on the horizon grew sharper against the fading light, the entire airfield seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a fragile moment where the truth hovered just beyond reach, and the quiet woman whom they had dismissed only hours earlier stood calm and unyielding at the center of an unfolding storm that none of them were prepared to face. The object approaching from the horizon carved a thin, predatory silhouette against the reddening sky, moving with a velocity too steady to be an ordinary aircraft, and carrying an intent too sharp to be anything but hostile, and the moment its faint metallic shimmer broke through the desert haze, every instinct on the airfield seemed to recoil in silent recognition. The quiet woman watched its advance with the composed stillness of someone who had encountered this pattern before, and although no words passed her lips, the subtle tightening of her posture revealed that the threat was neither random nor unexpected, but rather an echo from a past that had refused to stay buried. The captain stepped closer with a nervous urgency, demanding to know whether the base should issue an immediate alert, Yet the lieutenant hesitated to escalate protocols without explicit authorization, torn between the chain of command and the visceral certainty that whatever approached possessed capabilities far beyond standard reconnaissance craft. She opened the equipment case with a deliberate motion, retrieving a compact targeting scope modified with custom adjustments that no ordinary technician would have understood, and the captain's eyes widened as he realized she was assessing the incoming pattern with a familiarity bordering on muscle memory. Wind swept across the runway, carrying a deepening hum that resonated against the metal structures with an unnatural rhythm, causing several crew members to abandon their tasks and seek cover near reinforced barriers, while others lingered in frozen confusion, unable to process the magnitude of what was unfolding. She lifted the scope, adjusted a dial no one else recognized, and tracked the object's movement with a precision so effortless that the captain felt the hairs along his arms rise, recognizing that the skill he was witnessing belonged to someone far above their operational tier. When she exhaled slowly, lowering the scope as though confirming a grim expectation, the lieutenant murmured that the signal signature had just triggered a restricted alert code, one reserved for adversaries capable of penetrating advanced surveillance grids, and he admitted that even accessing the encrypted identifier required clearance levels he did not possess. The captain stared at her in disbelief, demanding to know how she seemed so prepared for a threat command had barely identified, yet she merely tightened the straps on her gloves, with a measured certainty that answered more than any explanation could. The object shifted direction with a sudden, predatory sharpness, its trajectory angling directly toward the Apache crews with an intent that shattered any remaining illusion of coincidence. And the lieutenant finally broke protocol by issuing an emergency order for all non-essential personnel to clear the runway immediately. Chaos erupted in measured fragments, boots pounding against concrete, radios crackling with overlapping commands, and the dull roar of engines preparing for rapid evacuation, yet she remained rooted in place beside the Apache, her gaze locked on the advancing threat, with the steadiness of someone bracing for a confrontation carved into her bones. The captain grabbed her arm, insisting she take shelter before the object entered actionable range. But the moment he touched her, she turned her head with such controlled intensity that his breath stalled, because the look in her eyes held the weight of someone who had survived battles no official record dared acknowledge. She told him, in a voice low and unwavering, that the threat was not targeting the base or its personnel, but specifically seeking a signature tied to her presence, and the shock of that revelation forced him to release her arm as though he had touched something burning. The object descended lower, its shadow stretching across the desert floor in a long, angular streak that pulsed like a warning, and for a brief moment the world fell into a tense, suspended quiet broken only by the rhythmic thrum of approaching machinery. She stepped forward, placing herself between the Apache and the incoming threat, her stance steady and grounded, and the captain sensed in her movements an echo of military conditioning, far older and far harsher than anything taught in their training manuals. The lieutenant continued relaying fragmented updates through his radio, announcing that the unidentified craft had breached perimeter range and triggered a top-tier countermeasure authorization, yet the voice of command on the other end carried a strange tone, one that shifted from protocol to fear the instant they learned she was on the airfield. She heard the hesitation, the recognition, the dawning realization that whatever approached was part of a conflict entwined with her history, and for the first time since dawn, she allowed a quiet exhale that sounded almost like resignation. The object's engines shifted pitch, producing a low oscillation that vibrated through the metal skin of the Apache, and several crew members flinched as static rippled through their radios, distorting channels in a way that suggested the craft's systems were actively interrogating the airspace for a specific encoded signature. She recognized the tactic instantly, the same method used during covert hunts conducted by adversarial units whose existence had been denied for years, and the tightening of her grip around the equipment case revealed that the threat was not merely familiar, it was personal. The captain, shaking despite himself, asked in a strained whisper whether her unit had created enemies capable of tracking her across continents, and although she offered no verbal answer, the slight lift of her chin confirmed a truth far more unsettling than any rumor whispered among pilots. The lieutenant finally abandoned hesitation, shouting for rapid deployment of emergency suppression teams, yet even as personnel scrambled to form defensive positions, she stepped forward again, placing herself at the very center of the runway as though preparing to be recognized by the threat she had spent years trying to outrun. The object descended further, its form gaining shape as a sleek, angular craft unlike anything in the standard catalog, and as its shadow washed over the tarmac, a palpable shift rippled across the airfield, one that told every watching soul that the quiet woman standing alone in the open was no longer merely a mystery. She was a signal, a catalyst, and possibly the very reason the threat had come. And as the first flicker of artificial light sparked along the underside of the craft, illuminating the tattoo hidden beneath her torn jumpsuit, the base finally understood that she was not a background technician at all. She was the unfinished chapter of a classified war, returning to life in real time. The unidentified craft hovered at the edge of the runway with a predatory patience that felt almost sentient, emitting a low harmonic vibration that rippled through the airfield and stirred a visceral instinct in every nearby soldier to either retreat or brace for impact. Even though none of them could fully understand the magnitude of the danger pressing toward them, the quiet woman remained motionless beneath its shadow, her posture steady and composed despite the suffocating tension gathering around her. And although she gave no outward sign of fear, the slight narrowing of her eyes revealed that she understood exactly what kind of confrontation was unfolding. The captain tried to call her back to the hangar, shouting above the rising hum that she needed to fall behind protective cover, but his voice cracked under the weight of a threat he could neither identify nor counter, and the desperation in his plea only highlighted how unprepared the base was to confront something engineered far beyond their familiar theaters of conflict. She did not step back. Instead, she adjusted the grip on the reinforced equipment case, with a subtle shift that conveyed both readiness and inevitability, as though she knew the craft's presence was not an attack on the base, but an attempt to draw her out of hiding. Several ground crew members stumbled in their retreat, unable to tear their eyes away from the eerie symmetry of the craft's hovering shape, and their panic spread in silent waves across the field as radios erupted with overlapping orders that contradicted one another, revealing how quickly command structure could fracture under the pressure of an unknown adversary. The lieutenant barked for suppression teams to stay on standby rather than engage, explaining through clenched teeth that any hostile action might escalate a scenario they barely understood, yet even his forced calmness faltered when he acknowledged that the craft's targeting systems appeared to be sweeping specifically toward the woman. She stepped forward again, positioning herself directly in the craft's line of sight with a deliberateness that stunned the captain into silence because her movements carried a sense of confidence that no ordinary technician should possess, and her eyes held an expression that suggested she had long anticipated this moment, even if she had hoped it would never arrive. The hum from the craft shifted abruptly into a sharper, more focused frequency, causing nearby metal surfaces to tremble as though responding to a coded resonance, and several personnel ducked instinctively when a thin beam of scanning light swept across the runway like an exposed nerve searching for its twin. The beam paused when it reached her, lingering on her form with an almost accusatory intensity, and although the captain shouted for her to move, she remained perfectly still, understanding that any sudden action could trigger the craft's next phase, which she suspected would be far less controlled than this initial reconnaissance. The lieutenant watched with wide, fearful eyes as the scanning light traced the faint outline of her torn flight suit, and when it passed over the hidden tattoo on her side, a subtle shift in the craft's oscillation made it clear the recognition was complete. The hum grew deeper, resonating like a distant storm gathering momentum, and for the first time she exhaled slowly, acknowledging that the craft had confirmed her presence and that there was no longer any possibility of blending back into anonymity. The captain demanded answers with a desperate urgency, insisting the base could not defend itself without understanding what they were truly facing. Yet she offered only a glance, heavy, resigned, and edged with memories he could never decipher, before turning her attention back to the hostile silhouette above. Alarms began to blare across the base, triggered not by enemy fire but by an automated threat protocol activated whenever sensors detected an unidentified craft exhibiting advanced scanning behavior, and the piercing sound echoed off metal walls with a shrill clarity that forced every remaining crew member to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. The lieutenant relayed frantic updates through his radio, announcing that command was scrambling, jamming teams, and redirecting air defense assets. But even he knew the response was purely symbolic, because no conventional defense measure had been designed with this kind of adversary in mind. She lowered the equipment case and pressed her palm against a concealed biometric panel near its hinge, revealing a compartment containing a compact device that emitted a faint blue glow, and the captain stared in stunned disbelief, realizing that whatever she carried was not standard military tech, but something crafted for operations buried deeper than black tier clearance. She checked the device with a precision that surpassed even her earlier calm, as though she were preparing not merely to counter a threat, but to confront a past mission rising from the shadows. The craft lowered another meter, stirring the desert dust into spiraling eddies around her feet, and its pulsing lights intensified in a pattern she recognized immediately, an encoded signal used by an adversarial reconnaissance division, known for isolating former operatives before initiating retrieval or elimination protocols. The captain finally grasped the truth that had been circling them for hours. The craft was not here because of the base. It was here because of her. The lieutenant stumbled backward as the light pattern intensified, and he shouted that the base would have to initiate a full lockdown if the craft continued its advance. But she cut him off with a calm, steady statement that halted him mid-command, explaining that lockdown procedures would only escalate the craft's hostility because it interpreted defensive posturing as confirmation of secondary targets. The implication settled over the captain with a cold weight, forcing him to accept that she possessed knowledge no ordinary soldier should carry, and that perhaps the only person capable of preventing an escalation was the same woman they had spent the morning underestimating. She stepped fully into the center of the runway, letting the scanner lock onto her without resistance, and the craft responded with a subtle but unmistakable shift, one that acknowledged her presence not as a target among many, but as the singular signature it had been programmed to find. The captain felt the truth closing around them like a tightening vice. Her identity, whatever it truly was, could no longer remain concealed, and the confrontation unfolding before them could only end one way. And as the shimmering glow intensified across the craft's hull, illuminating the tattoo beneath her torn suit with stark, unmistakable clarity, everyone on the airfield sensed that the moment of revelation, whatever form it would take, had become unavoidable. The hovering craft shifted its angle with a predatory precision that sent a ripple of instinctive dread through everyone watching, its underside blooming with faint geometric sigils that pulsed like a heartbeat made of artificial light. And although no weapon was visible, the dense pressure rolling off its frame made the airfield feel as though it were standing at the edge of an oncoming storm. She adjusted her stance with the calm certainty of someone bracing for an inevitable collision, her fingers tightening around the glowing device inside the equipment case as a subtle resonance hummed between her and the hovering craft, suggesting a recognition deeper than simple identification. The captain shouted for her to retreat behind the barricades, his voice cracking as fear overwhelmed his sense of protocol, yet she did not move, because she understood that stepping away now would only provoke a hostile shift in the craft's threat assessment, turning a controlled engagement into a catastrophic assault that the base had no capacity to withstand. Several soldiers crouched behind armored crates, gripping their weapons with trembling hands, and although they knew their rifles were useless against something engineered with capabilities they could barely comprehend, instinct still demanded they be prepared to fight, even if the odds bordered on impossible. The craft emitted a sharp fluctuation of light that stung the eyes and caused nearby digital instruments to flicker erratically, and the lieutenant, now drenched in cold sweat, reported through his distorted radio that the scanning frequency had escalated into a pre-engagement phase reserved for forceful retrieval operations, though the phrase alone barely conveyed the magnitude of danger surging through the air. She lifted the glowing device with both hands, allowing it to interface with the light patterns emanating from the craft, and the moment the two signals collided, a crackling resonance surged across the runway, like a silent thunderclap that only those trained in classified fields would understand. The captain staggered backward, unable to believe that she was not merely reacting instinctively but engaging the craft through a communication protocol that appeared to be encoded into the very architecture of its design, and the realization that she belonged to the same shadowed world as this hostile intruder sent an involuntary chill through everyone within sight. She took another step forward, her voice barely audible as she uttered a sequence of syllables that carried a rhythmic cadence unlike any language spoken openly in military channels, and the craft paused mid-hover as if recognizing a command buried deep within its operational matrix. For a brief moment, The airfield froze under the weight of an impossible stillness, because even the wind held its breath, as the craft emitted a deep harmonic tone that felt less like a sound and more like an acknowledgement, a recognition of authority that should not have belonged to someone dressed in a torn jumpsuit. Serving on an airbase's ammunition detail, the lieutenant gasped as his tablet flickered with symbols he had never seen in any database, and the captain, trembling with disbelief, whispered that her voice and the device were somehow overriding the craft's directives, though he could not fathom how such a feat was even conceivable. The craft responded by releasing a piercing burst of kinetic distortion that struck the ground only meters away from her, sending a shock wave rolling across the runway and forcing several soldiers to dive behind whatever cover they could find. Yet she remained standing, with only a slight recoil, her posture absorbing the impact with a resilience that betrayed years of training under conditions far harsher than any imaginable by ordinary personnel. She lifted the device higher, manipulating its controls with fluid expertise as she countered the craft's rising aggression, and the resonance between them intensified into a pulsing exchange of energy that vibrated through the ground with a living, almost feral intensity. Another wave of distortion surged from the craft, this one sharper and aimed directly at her. Yet she pivoted with astonishing speed, using the device to project a narrow field of interference that cracked visibly through the air, splitting the incoming force enough to redirect it away from the Apache and into an empty stretch of desert where it detonated harmlessly in a plume of dust. The watching soldiers stared in shock, struggling to reconcile the impossible sight of a single woman deflecting an attack from a hostile craft engineered for advanced interception missions, and even the captain, who had begun to suspect her capabilities, felt the ground shift beneath the weight of what he was witnessing. Lights along the craft's hull began to spiral in erratic patterns, indicating a recalibration of its offensive protocol, and she recognized instantly that it was preparing for a rapid escalation that would overwhelm the entire base if she failed to interrupt its targeting sequence at this exact moment. She braced herself and issued another coded vocal command, stronger, sharper, and edged with a restrained authority that sent a pulse racing across the airfield, and the craft hesitated, its light patterns faltering, as if torn between compliance and aggression. The moment stretched in a taut silence that felt like the world balancing on a wire, and then the craft unleashed a focused beam of compressed force aimed directly at her chest, an attack that would have vaporized any unprotected target within its path. Yet she reacted with a speed so fluid that the beam sliced past where she had been only an instant earlier. She rolled across the ground with controlled precision, landing in a crouched stance while activating the device in a manner that caused its glow to bloom into a broad wave of counter-resonance that slammed into the craft with shocking intensity. The impact forced the craft to wobble in midair, its stabilizers momentarily disrupted as sparks of distorted energy erupted from its undercarriage, and the airfield trembled beneath the force of its struggle to maintain controlled flight. Soldiers who had been hiding now stared openly, realizing that the woman they had dismissed as an unremarkable technician was engaged in a duel of technologies and capabilities far beyond anything their training had prepared them to witness. The captain, breathless and wide-eyed, finally understood that she was not merely someone with dormant knowledge of classified systems, but a former operator of a unit designed to counter threats exactly like the one hovering above them, a truth that shattered every assumption he had built since the morning began. She rose from her crouch, dust swirling around her in a silent halo, and her expression shifted into the hardened clarity of someone who had dropped the final barrier between who she pretended to be and who she truly was. And as the craft reeled from her counterattack, its destabilized lights flickering like a wounded predator, the entire base stood frozen in the irreversible understanding that the woman they had underestimated all day was no longer hiding. She was fighting as the operative she had once been. The destabilized craft steadied itself with a violent shudder that rattled every loose panel across the airfield, unleashing a new pulse of mechanical fury that rippled through the desert air like the roar of some engineered predator, refusing to yield its hunt, and the moment it regained balance, its lights sharpened into thin, blade-like beams that traced angular patterns across the sky with unmistakable intent. She rose from her crouch with dust clinging to her gloves, her breathing steady despite the force she had just endured, and although the attack had been powerful enough to kill most operators instantly, Her posture revealed a practiced resilience born from countless confrontations she had never spoken about. The captain stared at her with a mixture of awe and disbelief, struggling to reconcile the woman now standing before him with the quiet technician he believed he had met earlier that morning. And the weight of that realization settled into his chest like a tightening knot that threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew about war and the people who fought it in silence. The lieutenant gripped his radio with trembling fingers, attempting to relay the impossible scene unfolding before him to command. Yet every attempt to describe her counterattack came out fragmented, as though his mind could not translate what his eyes were witnessing into language that felt grounded in reality. The craft shifted its position again, lowering itself until the dust beneath it spiraled into violent whirlwinds that stung the exposed skin of every soldier still within range, and the atmosphere thickened with an oppressive static that suggested it was preparing to escalate beyond reconnaissance-level aggression into full offensive mode. She recognized the change instantly, the same way a seasoned operator recognizes the exact moment a battlefield transitions from threat to lethal inevitability, and her expression tightened with a grim understanding that the next strike would be far more devastating than anything the base could absorb without catastrophic losses. She activated the device once more, adjusting its dials with fluid accuracy while channeling a steady ripple of counter-resonance that pushed back against the craft's escalating aggression, and the glow intensified until it cast faint blue reflections onto her torn flight suit, revealing more intricate segments of the forbidden tattoo that had remained hidden until this moment. The captain saw those markings and felt a cold shock travel up his spine, realizing that each segment of the tattoo responded to the device's energy as though it were part of a unified system designed for synchronized operation, and he finally understood that her identity was not just symbolic, but functional. The craft emitted a piercing shriek of distorted frequencies, launching a continuous beam of compressed force toward the runway that scorched a burning line across the ground and sent several soldiers tumbling backward as they desperately sought cover behind reinforced barriers. Yet she did not move until the final second, when she pivoted sharply and redirected the device's output into a sweeping arc that fractured the beam into dissipating fragments. The impact exploded into a cloud of dust and shattered concrete, forcing the captain to shield his face as debris rained across the base, and when he looked again, she was already charging forward with a speed and precision that shattered any lingering doubt regarding her true nature. Her movements carried the unmistakable rhythm of tactical enhancement training footwork designed to minimize exposure, micro-adjustments crafted to manipulate enemy target locks, and a fluid repositioning style that only graduates of black-tier combat programs ever achieved. Yet she executed them with such natural fluency that even the lieutenant, who had once studied specialized maneuver protocols, felt a deep ache of inferiority as he watched her. The craft reacted by launching a series of pulsed shockwaves intended to corral her into a predictable path, but she weaved between them with a dancer's precision and a soldier's lethal pragmatism, each step calculated to exploit micro-intervals in the craft's trajectory that no untrained eye could even perceive. With every counterstrike she delivered, the lights beneath the craft flickered erratically, signaling that its core stabilizers were struggling to reconcile the interference she generated, and the captain realized that she was not merely repelling attacks, but disrupting the craft's central navigation field in a way that suggested intimate knowledge of its internal architecture. She issued another coded command, low, rhythmic, and carved with authority, and the air trembled as the craft hesitated again, caught between aggression and forced recognition, and the lieutenant watched with wide, terrified eyes as his encrypted tablet displayed symbols that matched the hidden segments of her tattoo. A heavy silence fell across the base as the craft began to spiral upward, preparing what appeared to be a final, decisive strike that would level the entire airfield if left unanswered. And in that breathless pause, every soldier understood that the fate of the base rested entirely on the actions of the lone woman standing in the center of the runway. She raised the device above her head, adjusting its output until its glow expanded into a concentrated sphere of pulsing energy, and her eyes narrowed with a fierce determination that revealed she had shed the last remnants of the identity she had worn to remain invisible. The craft unleashed its final assault, a massive, crackling burst of kinetic force that tore through the air with the fury of a descending meteor, and she responded with a perfectly timed release of counter-resonance that collided with the incoming attack in a blinding explosion of light and sound, sending a concussive wave across the desert that knocked several soldiers to their knees. The collision illuminated the runway with an otherworldly brilliance, casting sharp shadows that danced across the surrounding hangars. And when the blinding haze finally dissipated, the craft had been forced into a retreating wobble, its stabilizers failing as it struggled to maintain altitude. The base erupted into stunned silence as she lowered the device, her expression carrying the calm exhaustion of someone who had accepted an unavoidable burden and survived its opening battle. And for the first time that day, every member of the airfield understood the truth they had spent hours resisting. She was not an ordinary technician, nor an anonymous support crew member lost among the countless faces assigned to routine duties. She was an operative forged in a clandestine program designed to counter threats like the craft now faltering above them, and the base had just witnessed the first true glimpse of the warrior she once was. And as the craft limped backward toward the reddening horizon, trailing sparks from its destabilized frame, the reality settled over the airfield like a heavy shroud of revelation. She had not only defended the base, she had revealed the first fracture in a threat far larger than anyone dared to imagine. The wounded craft drifted backward across the darkening horizon with a flickering instability that betrayed both its damaged systems and its lingering reluctance to disengage, leaving behind a trembling silence that settled across the airfield like the aftermath of an unseen earthquake. And for several suspended seconds, no one dared move or even breathe, as though any sound might provoke the machine into returning for a second assault. She lowered the glowing device slowly, her hands steady despite the residual hum vibrating through its casing, and although her posture remained composed, the faint tension in her shoulders revealed that she understood the retreat was not a surrender, but a recalibration preceding something far more dangerous. The captain approached her cautiously, his steps faltering with the hesitancy of someone addressing a force he no longer knew how to categorize, and although he opened his mouth to speak, the words tangled in his throat as he struggled to reconcile the enormity of what she had just accomplished with the assumptions he had carried into the morning. The lieutenant arrived moments later, visibly shaken and gripping his encrypted tablet as though it were a lifeline, reporting in a strained whisper that the craft had vanished from radar entirely, cheating the surveillance systems in a manner that suggested an intentional cloaking mechanism designed to obscure its next approach. Several soldiers emerged from behind their makeshift cover, blinking through the settling dust with the disoriented expressions of people attempting to convince themselves that the threat had truly passed, yet the unease lingering in their posture revealed that the encounter had destabilized something fundamental in their understanding of warfare. She walked toward the Apache with a steady stride, inspecting the aircraft as though ensuring no hidden damage had compromised its operational readiness, and the simplicity of her movements contrasted sharply with the weight of the battle she had just endured. Before the captain could ask the questions burning across his features, a convoy of command vehicles barreled onto the airfield, their flashing lights slicing through the twilight like blades of authority, and the sudden appearance of high-ranking officers sent a ripple of alarm through the remaining personnel. A stern colonel stepped out first, followed by a team of intelligence officers with clipped strides and guarded expressions, and their collective demeanor made it immediately clear that the confrontation with the craft had triggered protocols far above the captain's pay grade. The colonel's gaze locked onto her with a mixture of calculation and disbelief, as though he were staring at a ghost he had never expected to see again, and his first words were not a greeting, but a sharp demand to know what she had activated and why an unidentified craft had responded to her presence with targeted aggression. She did not answer immediately, choosing instead to close the equipment case with deliberate finality, and the colonel's tightening grip on his belt revealed his impatience growing beneath a thin veil of professional control. The intelligence officers circled her with clipped precision, their questions firing rapidly and overlapping one another, requests for her identification code, inquiries about her deployment history, demands for clarity regarding the tattoo partially visible beneath her torn jumpsuit. And although she acknowledged each voice with a calm, steady gaze, she offered no explanation, because she understood that any truth she provided now would only fuel further entanglement in a system that had once chosen to erase her existence. The captain attempted to intervene, insisting she had saved the base and deserved at least a moment to collect herself, but the colonel silenced him with a single cold glance, reminding him that heroism did not exempt anyone from accountability when classified technology had been deployed on domestic soil. She remained silent, her expression carved with a composed detachment that both unsettled and intrigued the gathered officers, and the lieutenant watched with dawning dread as he realized she was being drawn into an interrogation designed not to understand her actions but to contain them. The colonel ordered her to relinquish the device for immediate analysis. Yet when she held it closer instead of handing it over, several intelligence agents moved instinctively forward, only to stop when the device emitted a faint pulse that made their earpieces crackle and their visors glitch, reminding everyone present that the technology in her possession did not fall under their jurisdiction. The colonel's voice hardened as he repeated his command, but she responded with a quiet statement that the device could not be transferred without triggering a failsafe that none of them were prepared to handle. And although her tone carried no threat, the underlying certainty in her words halted even the boldest agents. Frustration spread across the colonel's face as he struggled to assert authority over someone operating outside the boundaries of standard military hierarchy, and the officers exchanged wary looks as they realized they were confronting a figure whose operational history existed in classified strata they were never meant to access. The captain stepped closer, attempting once more to reason with command, arguing that her knowledge was essential to understanding the threat that had just attacked them. Yet the colonel cut him off sharply, declaring that her involvement posed a risk to national security until her origins were fully verified. She met the colonel's scrutiny without flinching, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the roar of the retreating craft, because every person on the airfield sensed that the walls closing around her were not built from suspicion alone, but from the weight of a history she had spent years trying to bury. The lieutenant lowered his gaze as he realized the truth had begun to corner her with a force greater than any enemy craft, and the captain clenched his fists in helpless frustration, knowing that the system was preparing to swallow her back into the shadows she had fought so hard to leave behind. The colonel finally issued a formal directive, placing her under immediate investigative custody, demanding she accompany the intelligence team to a secure facility for debriefing. And although the order was delivered with the cold precision of protocol, the tremor in his voice revealed his fear of the implications surrounding her identity. She did not resist. She simply closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if accepting the inevitable, then lifted her chin with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that the truth had grown too large to outrun any longer. And as the officers moved to escort her from the airfield, every soldier who had witnessed her battle stood frozen in a mixture of awe and guilt, realizing that the woman who had saved their lives was now being taken away by the very system she had protected, and that the revelation of who she truly was had only just begun to unfold. They escorted her toward the fortified command building with a tense formality that felt less like a routine protocol and more like a ritual carried out by people who didn't fully understand the magnitude of what they were touching. And although she walked without resistance, every step she took echoed with the heavy inevitability of a truth that had finally begun to hunt her back. The officers surrounding her maintained a rigid formation, their eyes fixed straight ahead, as if afraid that looking directly at her might reveal something they were not cleared to know, and the air between them pulsed with a quiet dread that only intensified as they neared the secure entrance. Inside the building, the lighting shifted to a sterile, bluish hue that cast harsh shadows across the narrow hallways, creating an atmosphere more reminiscent of a containment wing than a debriefing room, and the hum of hidden surveillance systems thrummed like a mechanical heartbeat beneath the concrete walls. The colonel walked slightly ahead, his posture tight with forced authority, yet the tremor in his stride hinted that he understood the risk of pressing someone whose history belonged to layers of classified operations few living officers had ever glimpsed. She was guided into an interrogation chamber, outfitted with reinforced panels, and a central table wired with biometric interfaces. And although the room was designed to dwarf its occupants through sterile intimidation, she sat down with the unshaken composure of someone who had spent far too many hours in rooms exactly like this, answering questions for people who believed they held power over her. The colonel remained standing, as two intelligence operatives activated the recording nodes, and one of them recited the formal initiation sequence with a mechanical precision that could not conceal the quiver beneath his breath. They began with procedural questions about her assignment history, deployment records, and authorization codes, yet every query only highlighted the impossible gaps in her file gaps so vast They felt intentional, as though someone had carved entire chapters out of existence and left behind only fragments meant to placate a system that never questioned missing answers until now. The colonel demanded clarification for each inconsistency, insisting that her silence constituted grounds for further containment, but she responded with a calm assertion that her clearance level did not permit verbal disclosure under conventional interrogation, a statement that rippled through the room with quiet authority. The operatives exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing the coded phrasing from protocols they had studied but never expected to encounter, and the colonel's frustration deepened as he realized that the usual tactics of intimidation would crumble against someone who had been molded for situations far more perilous than bureaucratic interrogation. The lieutenant, watching from the doorway with tightly clenched fists, attempted to interject on her behalf, arguing that the threat they faced demanded cooperation rather than containment. Yet the colonel silenced him again with a sharp command, unwilling to relinquish control even as it slipped further from his grasp. The interrogation shifted as the senior intelligence officer placed a tablet onto the table, activating a holographic projection of cryptic symbols matching those the retreating craft had emitted earlier, and he asked her almost pleadingly why the patterns responded to her tattoo when the scanning beam swept across her body. She studied the projection with a level gaze, recognizing the encoded sequence that once signaled initiation of hostile reconnaissance during covert operations, and for the first time since entering the room, a faint shadow crossed her expression. Not from fear, but from the weight of memory, stirring beneath carefully sealed layers. She answered that the symbols belonged to an adversarial division that her former unit had been created to counter, and although she omitted every classified detail, the mere acknowledgement ignited a surge of alarm across the officers present, because they understood that her words implied the existence of a program far beyond anything listed in their intelligence briefings. The colonel demanded specifics, unit designation, mission history, chain of command reporting structures, but she refused each request with steady restraint, explaining that any further disclosure required an override code held by command levels significantly higher than his. The tension inside the room thickened until it felt almost suffocating, and the lieutenant finally stepped forward with unexpected resolve, stating that withholding her cooperation would jeopardize the safety of every person on the base if the craft returned, because no conventional defense system had proven capable of repelling it. His words struck a nerve, not only with the colonel but also with the operatives who had witnessed her earlier battle, and an uncomfortable whisper of truth began circling the room. She had done what none of their tactical assets could have achieved. The colonel attempted to reassert control by ordering the biometric scanner to run a full-spectrum identity trace. Yet when the device activated, its interface flickered violently and emitted a warning signal that the subject belonged to a restricted category inaccessible to their clearance level, a revelation that shattered the last illusion of authority he believed he held over her. The officers recoiled slightly as the scanner repeated the failed access warning, and even the colonel's rigid composure wavered as he realized he was dealing with someone whose true designation had been placed far beyond the reach of standard military oversight. She sat unmoving as the system error echoed through the room, and for a moment, an almost imperceptible weariness flickered across her features, reflecting the burden of carrying an identity engineered to remain invisible until the day it was forcibly dragged into light. The lieutenant looked at her with widening understanding, recognizing that she was not merely refusing cooperation but protecting layers of classified history that had been buried for reasons none of them were allowed to comprehend, and his voice trembled as he asked whether the unit she once served still existed. Her gaze shifted toward him with a quiet gravity, and although she said nothing, the subtle dip of her head conveyed an answer that pierced the room with a cold clarity. The unit had not disappeared. It had simply gone deeper underground than anyone dared imagine. The colonel stepped back, stunned by the realization that the threat from the horizon and the woman sitting calmly before him were threads of the same forbidden history, and for the first time since her capture, fear replaced frustration in his eyes. And as the sterile lights hummed overhead, illuminating the faint edges of the tattoo hidden beneath her torn suit, everyone in the room understood that the first crack in her concealed identity had finally appeared, and that whatever truth lay behind it was powerful enough to change everything they believed about the war they were fighting. The failed biometric scan reverberated through the interrogation chamber like a silent explosion, turning every measured breath into a tremor of uncertainty as the officers realized they had stumbled into a classification tier that none of them possessed the authority to touch, and the colonel's rigid composure cracked under the weight of a revelation he could neither control nor fully comprehend. He attempted to reassert command by ordering a manual override, but the system rejected his credentials with an unforgiving monotone, prompting him to step back with the unease of a man confronting the limits of his own rank for the first time in years. Moments later, the chamber lights flickered as the building's internal network shifted into a restricted protocol layer, prompting a shrill alert tone that caused several operatives to instinctively straighten, sensing the descent of a higher chain of command they had hoped to avoid. The reinforced door slid open with a forceful hiss, and a major general stepped inside, flanked by black-suited advisors whose presence alone made the colonel stiffen in involuntary submission because their arrival meant this incident had already reached the uppermost levels of military oversight. The general's gaze swept across the room, settling on her with the cold precision of someone who had read about her in redacted files but never expected to see her alive, and the silence that followed carried the heavy implication that he recognized not only her tattoo, but the entire specter of classified history it represented. He dismissed the colonel with a curt gesture that brooked no argument, and although the colonel tried to protest by citing base security protocols, the general silenced him with a single sentence. "Protocols do not apply to ghosts we were ordered to pretend no longer existed. How one?" She did not react to his words, though the faint shift in her posture revealed that she understood the significance of a general acknowledging the truth beneath layers of operational secrecy, and the officers in the room exchanged horrified glances as they realized her identity had been known by people far above the ranks they interacted with. The general approached the table, placing a classified folder onto its surface with the slow deliberation of someone who had carried its contents through decades of silence, and he informed her that the program once known as Unit 7 had been formally dissolved only on paper, preserved unofficially through a sequence of shadow directives accessible to fewer than a dozen people in the entire defense network. The lieutenant's breath caught as he realized she was not merely a remnant of a forgotten operation, but one of the last operatives trained to intercept hostile signatures that ordinary forces were never meant to encounter, and the captain felt a cold hollowness settle into his stomach as he connected the craft's attack to the classified history unfolding before him. The general opened the folder, revealing pages lined with redacted text and diagrams that depicted the same geometric symbols encoded into her tattoo, and he stated with a grim finality that the adversarial division they once fought had resurfaced after years of silence, far stronger and far closer than any intelligence report had predicted. As he spoke, she listened with a restrained stillness that carried the weight of someone confronting the return of an enemy she had spent years believing she had escaped, and though she offered no outward emotion, the tension in her gaze betrayed the quiet dread of recognizing that her past was no longer content to remain buried. The general explained that the craft's appearance was not an isolated incident but part of a broader reconnaissance sweep detected across multiple black-tier surveillance nodes, all of which pointed toward a coordinated resurgence targeting former Unit 7 operatives. The colonel paled as he realized the threat had not come for the base but for her specifically, and the intelligence officers leaned forward with expressions of dawning horror as they understood that her presence had inadvertently shielded them from a much broader assault. The general raised his voice slightly, emphasizing that command required her full cooperation before the next wave arrived, because the patterns in the craft's attack signaled the early phase of a retrieval campaign designed to isolate and neutralize individuals with her level of specialized conditioning. She finally spoke, her voice low and steady, acknowledging that the craft's techniques matched those used during the final breaches her unit had countered before its dissolution, and the room fell silent as her admission confirmed the general's worst fears. The general leaned closer, stating that her reactivation was no longer optional but necessary, and that her insight held the only chance of predicting the adversary's next move before the base became a casualty in a conflict far beyond its operational understanding. Before any further discussion could unfold, the building shuddered with a low, resonant vibration that made the lights flicker and the reinforced panels groan under sudden pressure, prompting every officer to reach instinctively for their radios as the alarms outside erupted into a deafening chorus. The lieutenant's voice trembled as he relayed through the comms that an unidentified energy signature had reappeared at the edge of the airfield, stronger and more concentrated than the initial craft, and the captain felt the blood drain from his face as he recognized the same predatory hum that had preceded the earlier attack. The general snapped into command mode, ordering the interrogation chamber opened immediately and the subject transferred to strategic control. Yet the trembling walls made it clear they were already running out of time, because whatever approached was moving faster and with far greater intent than before. She rose from her chair with the calm readiness of a soldier stepping back into a role she had never truly abandoned, and although neither fear nor hesitation appeared in her eyes, a shadow of long-buried memory flickered across her expression, hinting at the battles she had hoped would never return. As the alarms intensified and the base shook beneath the weight of an approaching threat, every officer understood that the next confrontation would force the full truth of her identity into the open, and that the reveal they had spent hours trying to avoid was now barreling toward them with unstoppable force. The building trembled again as a deeper resonance rolled through the base, carrying a predatory frequency that slithered beneath the concrete like an approaching tide, and the faint vibrations running through the floor tiles made every officer in the chamber realize the enemy was no longer scanning for her, it was closing in to claim her. The general barked orders to secure all perimeter gates and reroute power to the defensive grid. Yet even as personnel scrambled to obey, the grim set of his jaw revealed he understood the base's defenses were ornamental against a force engineered to bypass conventional warfare entirely. She stepped into the hallway with a calmness so stark it made the surrounding chaos feel strangely distant, and although the lieutenant moved protectively beside her, the quiet steadiness of her gait suggested that she did not require shelter from the storm gathering beyond the reinforced walls. The alarms wailed through the corridors in sharp, stuttering pulses that echoed the rising threat outside, and each red flash illuminated the faint geometric pattern beneath her torn flight suit, revealing more of the tattoo that had remained hidden until the enemy forced it into the light. As they approached the central operations hub, technicians rushed from station to station attempting to lock onto the incoming signature, but their screens flickered with corrupted data streams that dissolved into geometric noise, as though the enemy were rewriting the sensors faster than the systems could interpret them. She paused briefly at the threshold, her eyes narrowing as the distorted patterns shimmered across the wall of monitors, and although she said nothing, the general recognized the subtle shift in her posture as the moment her dormant training surged awake. He ordered the room cleared for strategic coordination, but the captain refused to leave, insisting that she would not face the threat alone after defending them once already, and his unexpected defiance drew a flicker of acknowledgement from her, a silent concession that his loyalty, however untrained, carried a weight she did not dismiss. The lieutenant remained as well, gripping his tablet with trembling hands while struggling to decode the incoming interference, yet each fragment of deciphered data only confirmed that the craft outside was not a single unit but the vanguard of a coordinated assault. The general turned to her, stating in a low, grave tone that the time for withholding her identity had passed, because the enemy was broadcasting a signal encoded with the exact sequence of her unit's dissolution, as if attempting to awaken the ghosts of a war buried so deeply the military had forgotten how to speak of it. She rested her palm against the operations table, allowing the biometric interface to scan her skin, and the system flickered violently before stabilizing into a glowing authorization sequence that no one else in the room had ever seen, revealing a clearance code marked with classified layers older than the general himself. Shock rippled across the faces of those watching as the system displayed her true designation, not as a technician or enlisted support member, but as a former field operative of Unit 7's Counter-Recon Division, one of the few trained to identify, disrupt, and dismantle hostile technologies that operated outside standard warfare doctrine. The captain exhaled sharply, realizing the gravity of the truth she had carried in silence, and the lieutenant's voice cracked as he whispered that her presence on the base had never been a coincidence but a buried safeguard against an enemy. The military no longer remembered how to fight. Outside, the ground shook with a forceful thud as the hostile craft descended lower, its silhouette sharpening into the unmistakable form of a retrieval interceptor, and the airfield erupted with scattered panic as soldiers scrambled behind armored barriers that would offer no protection against what was coming. She lifted the glowing device from the equipment case, adjusting its dials with the measured precision of someone reacquainting herself with a weapon forged from the remnants of a world most people never knew existed, and the blue glow brightened into a pulsing aura that mirrored the patterns etched into her skin. The general gave a final nod of grim acceptance, acknowledging that the success of their survival now rested solely in her hands, and he stepped aside as she walked toward the blast doors leading back onto the runway. Each alarm pulse painted her silhouette in alternating red and shadow, carving her figure into the stark outline of a soldier returning to a battlefield she had spent years running from, and the hovering craft outside shifted in anticipation, as though recognizing the reemergence of the operative it had been programmed to pursue. She reached the doors, paused only long enough for the captain and lieutenant to catch up, and then stepped into the open air where the threat loomed like an omen carved into the evening sky. And, in that moment, the base understood that every layer of her hidden identity had finally converged into the warrior she was always meant to become.